name's Judith Shor Ning, and I came to Albuquerque when I was 2 years old in 1948 with my parents, Betty Rothschild Shor, who came from Helena, Arkansas, and my father, David Shor, who was rabbi at Congregation Albert for 30 years and then emeritus for another 20. They were looking for a place that felt like home, not a large congregation that would make them feel lost in the community, a congregation where they could relate directly to people. My mother was kind of a small town girl, and my dad had grown up being integral in his congregation and wanted to be able to know everybody and relate to them. He often said when it hit 200 members he would leave. That happened within the first 10 years, so 30 years after that he was still here. Albuquerque was the kind of community where, I guess first of all, he could be jack of all trades, where he didn't have a very limited, isolated role, but he could do a variety of things, be involved with the members of the congregation, with the community, with the greater state of New Mexico, and do everyday things, whether it be putting on the coffee or answering the door at the temple, to working for legislation in the state government. Back in the day, the rabbi was definitely a one-man show. The congregation had 2 paid staff, the custodian, Sam Davis, who was adored, and a part-time secretary bookkeeper, which was initially Mom Haas and then Ruth Baldwin. So my dad locked and unlocked the building, put on the coffee, answered the door, typed his own correspondence and sermons with carbon on a typewriter. He counseled, he handled emergencies that came in, you name it. My dad was jokingly called the Archbishop of Albuquerque. He was certainly the senior Jewish religious functionary. During the time that he was active, he was often the only rabbi in the state of New Mexico, and when he was not, the other rabbi or rabbis had been here less than 5 years. So if there was a funeral that needed to be dealt with, he was on a plane to Raton or Santa Rosa. If there was a bar mitzvah wanting, he would do the teaching remotely from Albuquerque. I remember one morning he woke up with extreme vertigo and had to go to a funeral out of town. And the doctor initially refused to let him go and then agreed to let him fly if he were accompanied. But there was nobody else to send. In Albuquerque, he was a member and often a founding member of, at the time, probably the majority of not-for-profit boards, from the NAACP to the YMCA, Goodwill, Boys and Girls Clubs, the Francis Lynn Home, which became All Faith, the United Way, which was the Council of Social Agencies. Pretty much every Jewish organization except those specific to B'nai Israel or women. And my mother was the member and usually the board member of all the women's organizations. He was the first rabbi to be the president of the Albuquerque Ministerial Alliance, and he and the other clergy would frequently speak from one another's pulpits. He had a regular arrangement with the Congregational Church, Reverend Parr. They covered for each other when they were on vacation. Some of the legislation that he worked for in Albuquerque included the first Marriage Act requiring a 3-day waiting period and blood test before being married. He was the real driver that made that happen. He also was instrumental in passing the Fair Housing Act in Albuquerque, and also working against right-to-work, so-called right-to-work legislation, both locally and statewide. The impact was such that he was often the primary spokesman for the clergy in Albuquerque, and received threats and death threats periodically from people who disagreed with his stance. Dad didn't have a lot of rabbis to be bosom buddies with, so he developed very strong relationships with the clergy around Albuquerque. He played golf with the priest at the Newman Center at the university. Actually, it was probably a post-memory, was the letter to the editor that former Governor Cargo took time to write when my dad passed away. Former Congregation Albert, Rabbi David Shor, will be missed by the entire community. He was an ecumenical pioneer who brought people of all religions, backgrounds, and races together. He built bridges and never divided the community. He was an innovator. When the Human Rights Act was passed in 1969, I appointed him to the first State Human Rights Commission. He served with fairness and understanding and compassion, and he launched that Civil Rights Act in a manner that few will forget. I suspect that that was also one of my dad's proudest moments.